What you're about to hear isn't a debate about policy. It's a senator standing on the floor of the United States Congress and saying out loud that his colleagues are deliberately leaving the country unprotected for the fourth time in a row. The Department of Homeland Security is unfunded. TSA agents are showing up to work without a paycheck. Coast Guard members, the men and women who patrol American waters, are going home to families who don't know how they'll pay their bills this month. FEMA, the agency responsible for disaster relief in states still recovering from hurricanes and typhoons, has effectively shut down. And the reason? A bipartisan deal was already made. The House passed it. The Senate had the votes. Democrats and Republicans agreed. Then, at the last moment, that agreement was walked back, with no counterproposal, no alternative, no negotiation. Just a no. Senator Sullivan didn't come to the floor angry. He said he moved past the anger phase. What he's feeling now is something more unsettling than anger. And if you listen carefully to what he's saying, you'll understand why. Because this isn't just a budget dispute. This is a pattern. And patterns left unchecked become precedents. Let's talk about what's actually happening here.
Senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to come down and make a few remarks on a couple important topics. But I wanted to begin by just letting the American people know, my constituents back home in Alaska, what just happened here just a couple minutes ago on the Senate floor. We voted again to fund the Department of Homeland Security. And, Mr. President, I'm down here like a lot of senators. By the way, bipartisan Senate vote to fund Homeland Security, but it didn't pass. And, you know, I've kind of moved through my anger phase more to my sadness phase with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This is the fourth time that we have come down to the Senate floor to vote on a bipartisan, bicameral agreement. The House and the Senate got together several weeks ago. Democrats and Republicans agreed to fund the Department of Homeland Security. The House passed the bill, bipartisan, by the way. The agreed bill was going to come over here. It did come over here. And all of a sudden, my Democratic colleagues on the other side of the aisle, not all of them, Senator Fetterman has been voting with us, said, you know what, we're not going to keep that promise. We're going to not fund Homeland Security. Now, Mr. President, it's really frustrating because they're saying, well, they don't want to do it now because they want to reform ICE. Now, I'm a little skeptical of that claim because the White House and Republicans in the Senate have been waiting for weeks for any proposal from the Democrats on their reforming ICE. The White House and others have put forward, hey, here's our proposals. They haven't responded once. So if they want to reform ICE, they should at least give people in the administration or in the Congress here on the Republican side their ideas for reforming ICE. They haven't. It's been weeks. By the way, the press is not reporting that. I wish they would, because it's very bad faith when you're not negotiating at all. It's one thing to be far apart on, hey, I have this proposal, you have this proposal. They haven't put forward one proposal. So in the meantime, when we have a very dangerous world out there, we've been briefed in classified hearings that we should anticipate the Iranian Quds Force, lead terrorist organization in Iran, is looking for attacks in our homeland, and they won't fund Homeland Security. Now, Mr. President, one of the things that I'm a little concerned about is that this is kind of from the old Biden Majority Leader Schumer playbook to defund the police and have open borders. Now, what do I mean? We know during the Biden administration, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, many of them, and certainly the Biden administration, they had as policies, we're going to defund law enforcement and we're going to have open borders. That's what they did. 11 million people illegally came into our country during the 4 years of Joe Biden. And they also knew that the American people did not like those policies. I think that was clear in the 2024 election. But here's the thing, Mr. President, the far left of the Democratic Party is still committed to these policies. So essentially, when you look at what's going on right now, it's back to the future. It's defund the police and open borders 2.0. What am I talking about? Right now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are saying they will not fund ICE. That's a law enforcement agency that helps protect us. And they're also saying they will not fund Customs and Border Patrol. That's the agency that controls the border. It's defund the police, defund law enforcement, and open borders. Once again, they're trying to do it kind of in a backdoor way. But the American people are noticing, Mr. President, and it's a frustration. You know, the Democratic leader used to oppose shutdowns. As a matter of fact, when we were in the minority here, President Biden was in office, Senator Schumer was a majority leader, we never had one shutdown. Now, the reason is when we were negotiating things and we got close, but we weren't there yet, and we ran into the deadline of the government shutting down, we would pass what are called short-term continuing resolutions to keep the government open and keep negotiating. Senator Schumer said in 2019 that defunding DHS, which is what they're doing now, would, quote, hurt TSA, hurt Border Patrol, hurt FBI agents, air traffic controllers, food safety inspectors, Coast Guard members. They deal with our security right now. So if you believe in the security of America, vote yes to fund Homeland Security. I'm quoting Senator Schumer. Well, I would agree with his 2019 quote wholeheartedly. Vote yes to fund Homeland Security by keeping our country safe by all those agencies that he just mentioned. But now, again, given by far left-wing tactics and energy in the Democratic Party, anytime, and we saw this in the fall, and we're seeing it right now, that they don't get their way on an issue, they don't do what we have traditionally done, which is, all right, we're not there yet, let's compromise, let's put forward a short-term CR, let's keep the government open. They just say, let's shut down the government. So that's what we're dealing with, Mr. President. It's a real travesty. It's particularly a travesty for the TSA agents who aren't getting paid, for the Coast Guard agents who aren't getting paid and their families, for FEMA. We all have states, including especially mine, where disasters happen. We're still recovering from a big typhoon last fall. The payments going to our state for disaster relief. FEMA shut down. And Mr. President, it just doesn't have to happen. It just doesn't have to happen. We just voted again in a bipartisan way to do what the bipartisan agreement with the House and Senate was. Let's fund Homeland Security. By the way, there are reforms for FEMA in that bill. There's $2 million of de-escalation training. That's really important. There's $20 million for body cams, for ICE. And yet, for whatever reason, they don't want to fund the government during this dangerous time. I hope that there's a compromise coming forward. The rumor is that after, I think, 5 weeks, our Democrat colleagues are going to finally respond to the White House and Republicans with their ideas. But again, it's hard to say you want compromise, you want reform on ICE when you haven't put forward anything in almost 2 months. That's not negotiating in good faith. But I'm hopeful, Mr. President. This is too darn important for the safety of our citizens during a dangerous time, for the men and women of the Coast Guard who do such heroic work and are now not getting a paycheck. My Democrat colleagues need to quit listening to the far left, come to the middle, and do what we've always done: compromise and vote to fund the government.
Let me give you the context first, because without it, this looks like just another partisan argument on the Senate floor. And it is not. A bipartisan agreement to fund the Department of Homeland Security was reached weeks ago. Not a Republican deal, not a Democratic deal, a deal. The House passed it with votes from both sides of the aisle. It came to the Senate with momentum and with legitimacy. And then, at the last moment, the Democratic caucus pulled back. No counter-proposal, no alternative legislation, no formal response to the White House's reform proposals, just a withdrawal. And then it happened again, and again, and again. Senator Sullivan wasn't describing a negotiation that broke down. He was describing a negotiation that was never allowed to begin. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters in these moments. Sullivan's frustration isn't simply that Democrats voted no. In a functioning legislature, votes against proposals happen all the time. That is the system working. What he's identifying is something more specific, the absence of a counteroffer. When one side puts forward proposals and the other side goes silent for weeks, that isn't a disagreement. That is a refusal to engage. And a refusal to engage has consequences that go far beyond the political theater of a Senate floor speech. Those consequences have names and faces. TSA agents are screening your luggage at the airport right now without knowing when their next paycheck is coming. Coast Guard members are conducting search and rescue operations in American waters while their families sit at kitchen tables trying to figure out which bills to defer. FEMA, the agency responsible for coordinating disaster relief, has suspended payments to states still recovering from floods, fires, and, in Sullivan's case, a typhoon that hit Alaska last fall. These are not abstract budgetary line items. These are real people absorbing the cost of a political stalemate they had no part in creating. Here is the part of Sullivan's speech that I think deserves the most careful attention. He quoted Senator Schumer, the current Democratic leader, from 2019, when Schumer was arguing passionately that defunding DHS would hurt TSA, hurt Border Patrol, hurt the FBI, hurt the Coast Guard. Schumer was right in 2019. And Sullivan is using that quote not to score a cheap political point, but to expose something structurally important. The argument for funding Homeland Security does not change based on who is in power. The Coast Guard doesn't become less essential because the political winds shifted. TSA agents don't need their paychecks less urgently because one party is trying to send a message to the other. The institution doesn't care about the politics. It just stops functioning. Let me also address the ICE reform argument directly, because it deserves a serious response rather than a dismissal. The stated reason for blocking the funding is that Democrats want reforms to immigration and customs enforcement built into any agreement. That is a legitimate policy goal. Oversight of federal law enforcement agencies is not just reasonable, it is constitutionally appropriate. But here is where Sullivan's critique lands with force. Reform requires a proposal. It requires something on paper that the other side can read, evaluate, accept, modify, or reject. If you want reform as a condition of funding, you have to define what reform means. Weeks of silence is not a negotiating position. It is an absence of one. And you cannot hold essential government services hostage to a demand you haven't articulated. There is a broader pattern worth naming here, because it transcends this specific funding fight. Over the last several years, the government shutdown has evolved from a last resort into a first move. What used to be the nuclear option, the thing both parties agreed to avoid at almost any cost because of the damage it caused to real people and real institutions, has become a tactical instrument, a way to apply pressure, a way to signal base voters. And every time it is used that way, it does two things simultaneously. It hurts the people who depend on government services, and it erodes the norm that made government shutdowns rare in the first place. When norms erode, they don't come back easily. The history of democratic institutions is full of examples of procedural guardrails that were bent once for good reasons, then bent again for lesser reasons, then abandoned entirely because the precedent had already been set. Continuing resolutions, emergency funding mechanisms, bipartisan agreements on basic government operations, these are the scaffolding that holds the structure up while the larger political fights play out. When that scaffolding is used as a weapon, the structure itself becomes unstable. Sullivan ended his speech with something that I think is worth sitting with. He said he is hopeful. He said compromise is still possible. He said this is too important for the men and women of the Coast Guard, for disaster survivors waiting on FEMA, for the safety of American citizens during what every classified briefing is describing as a genuinely dangerous moment for the homeland. Hope is not a strategy, but it is, sometimes, the only honest thing left to say when the alternative is admitting that the system you swore to serve is failing the people it was built to protect. The question now is whether both sides of the aisle are willing to hear that, before the cost gets any higher.